Now, very interesting topic this evening. Sensitivity, intuition. And I don't know about all of you, but I think we live in a world where actually we really need heightened sensitivity and intuition in the learning process. I think we're dealing with a lot of triggers, a lot of emotions, the world as it is today. I think all of us are extremely affected. I don't know what all of you think, but definitely the last 2 years, I think, has had an impact on each and every one of us in whichever way, especially kiddies, especially teenagers, you know, that sort of 2 years pause of not having certainty, of actually a lot of insecurity about how the world was going, a lot of repression of what they can and can't do, especially social interaction. And I do think this is something that now we're seeing the opposite effect. I think now we're all of us trying to socially interact as much as we can to make up a little bit for that lost time. Now, tonight's webinar is about being a language whisperer. How many of you can remember that film with Robert Redford, The Horse Whisperer? And by the way, we've got a lot of people now who are dog whisperers, you know, dog trainers that come in and help dogs and to listen how they're behaving and what's happening. And in some ways, I do think as language educators, this is a little bit where all of us need to go. We need to go to that depth to really read between the lines. Now, I'd like to start tonight with a little story. And some of you may know this story, some of you may not. And this is a pre-pandemic story. Possibly about 4 or 5 years ago, in Barcelona, I went to pick up a friend from the airport at Barcelona. For those of you who know the airport there, in the arrivals area, there are some shops. In many airports there are shops, but in the arrivals area, there were some shops. And I was walking around, having a walk, looking, you know, at whatever, just to pass the time, waiting for my friend to arrive. As I passed by one shop, something very unusual caught my eye. And as I looked, what had caught my eye was, you know how you've got the mannequins standing in the shops with the dresses or whatever? Actually, in the shop window, next to one of the mannequins, was a little old lady sitting there. And when I looked at her, honestly, it was like the frozen rabbit. She was staring into space, absolutely unusual position. And instantly I could see that she was in fight or flight. And I went to her. And I went down to her level, looked her straight in the eye, and I said, "Are you okay?" Very calm, very slow. And all she did was shake her head. My next question was, what language do you speak? I had no idea. And actually, she was from a Slav language family. And she could tell me in broken English that she'd lost her passport, she'd lost her ticket. Oh, no, sorry, she'd lost her ticket, not her passport. And she'd been to check in and they wouldn't check her in. And literally, she was in panic. Now, from that moment of just passing a shop and seeing something strange and not understanding there's something not right and just checking in and going over to her, that was a split second of sensitivity. I don't know where it came from, but my intuition and my whatever I saw in those split seconds, that is what we have to really start developing. And by the way, just to give you the happy ending to the story, I then got into my very directive, non-coach mode, went to the airport staff and started screaming at them. And we got her on the plane. She actually got away. They created a new ticket. They did a copy and she got off. And believe me, I was very directive. And I was also really, really unhappy that they hadn't been able to deal with it before. I don't care if there's a language barrier or not. There was no excuse how nobody in that airport had been able to help that lady in the check-in. And may I say, I made that known to them. Maybe not in a polite way, but I really did let them know how I felt. Now, this is what we have to develop. This is the sensitivity. But at the same time as we develop the sensitivity, we have to develop the way to try to check in. Am I right? Am I not? And how to go deeper to read between the lines. That's where we're going this evening. Now, let me just share the screen. And just to share with all of you, I've only just 5 minutes ago finished these slides, as Roxana knows, because I had to ask my group to give me a little bit of space and time to be able to come into this. Right, so the language whisperer, becoming the intuitive. We're in the 21st century. This 21st century is providing us with endless challenges. We've just come out of a pandemic. Unfortunately, we're still in this terrible situation with Ukraine and the aggression in Ukraine, which I think none of us accept and want. So, and all over the world, we have uncertainty, we have financial crashes, we've got educational systems all over the place, teachers stressed out. And this is, I know last week, a lot of you were asking if we can do some webinars on how to help us. But at the same time, we are in the most beautiful moment to take advantage, to understand how can we change. So instead of focusing on all the negative, how can we focus on all of the positive and embrace all of the information, all of the tools, and really run with it? And I do think here, you know, we are learning to reconnect. We're learning to connect brain, heart, intuition. And we're going to look at this today. This is the theme, the holistic educator. Now, I can imagine that all of you, you've signed up for this. So I can imagine you are already in this and you're already wanting or doing it. So first, I want to say thank you for being here. Now, let's have a little look at intuition. What is it? Well, as many of you know, I love to go to the dictionary to find definitions. And I always think it's interesting to come to definitions because, you know, here we can see it is that power or capacity to get direct knowledge or cognition without evident rational thought. Goodness, what does that mean? That we bypass our rational brain and literally it's the subconscious brain taking over? Yes, it is. So this is something that we feel in our gut. And in many of your languages, I think you've all got the same expression. In Spanish, I think in las entrañas, I think it's the same in French, in the intestines, the gut, wherever intuition is. And we're going to have a look at that in a minute as well. By the way, I love this quick and ready insight as well. As coaches, we need and want that provocation of insights with our learner. Continuously, we want them having their own insights. So that's the dictionary definition. Now, let's have a look at the neurological basis of this. Well, a few things to say here. You know, we are, well, the capacity of the brain is phenomenal. We are pattern recognition. May I say beings instead of machines. We are pattern recognition beings. So those gut feelings are literally messages coming from the insula and the amygdala. So they are coming from the brain, messages coming through. And actually, Antonio Damasio, one of the neuroscientists, very famous neuroscientist, actually calls these somatic markers. And these somatic markers are giving us those sensations of right, wrong, good, bad. And look how Steve Jobs actually said that intuition is more powerful than intellect. Can I give you a little bit of an anecdote that's just tripped through my prefrontal cortex there? Let me give you a little story. And I'm curious, I would love your response in the chat box here. In America, in the US Army, there is the story that they were actually very interested in a certain gentleman who was a native Indian, who was a phenomenal tracker. He could track anything, wild animals, people. He was famous for being a phenomenal tracker. And they actually, the US Army, they recruited this gentleman because, well, whatever reason they had, let's not go into that, but they recruited him. However, as soon as they recruited him and he started working or tracking for them, he suddenly lost his ability to track. What's the reason for that, everybody? Let's see if any of you know in the chat box. Any ideas? Lost contact with nature? No, not yet. No. Hello from Moldova, yes, but that's not the answer. Stress? No. Oh, you're going to love this, everybody. Lost freedom? No. What happens when you go in the army? What's the first thing they do? What's the first thing they do when they recruit? Yes, Valerie! Yes! They cut their hair. And what we now know is that hair is the extension of our nerves. And he lost his ability to track because his intuition was coming from that particular. I thought you'd love that story, everybody. It's a true story, by the way. You can have a look at it. Yes, his intuition was lost. Yes, absolutely. They cut the hair, nerve endings. Yeah, absolutely. Valerie, well done. Well done. So, neurological basis of intuition, could it be that it's actually in other places that we never imagined? Yes. Really interesting to think about that. So, another thing I just want to mention is that our brain, not only is it a pattern recognition phenomena, it's also a predictive phenomena. Split seconds before, our brain is already predicting things. And, you know, it's really quite interesting. If you think in your life, can you recognize any moments where you actually could feel that sort of understanding of what was going to happen? And I think you'd be amazed if you just observe events in your life, you might find that, yes, you can name quite a few moments where you've gone into that sort of, this is going to happen mode. And seconds later, it's happened. I have to share, you know, a couple of months ago, my mum actually fell down the stairs. And I swear, everybody, seconds before the thought crossed my head, she's going to fall. She did. Unbelievable. But how many times do we listen to that? We don't. We ignore it. And this is where it's about us connecting back into what signals and what messages are coming through. Now, interestingly, I do think that it's about, as educators, one of the major topics is empathy. How many times do you hear coaches are empathetic? Actually, I think educators are empathetic, full stop. Whether you're a coach, a teacher, a trainer, an educator, a parent, you have to have empathy. You know, we live in a world where empathy is king, queen, whatever. So I think all of us actually are quite empathic as humans. We're wired to be social. We're wired to be connected. We are, in fact, wired to care. The psychologist Dacher Keltner in the US, he really does, from his research, see that basically we do care for each other. It's a basic feeling that we all have for each other. Now, Daniel Goleman, in an article in the Harvard Business Review, actually talks about 3 types of empathy. You've got the cognitive empathy, which is this ability to understand another person's perspective, not only my perspective of life. Remember, we all have different neural maps. We all interpret the world in a different way. How you interpret the world is totally different to how I do. And as an educator, I need to make sure that I'm finding out how you interpret the world. Then we've got the emotional empathy. Now, this is a little bit where I want to hone in. It's the ability to feel what someone else feels. Now, if I've never had that experience in my life, how can I feel what you're feeling? That's an interesting question. And thirdly, we've got the empathic concern. The ability to sense what you need from me. Now, actually, as a coach, we directly go in to ask, how can I help? What do you need? What can I do for you to move you forward? So I think the third one is about finding out. You can sense it, but there's also that question of, am I sensing it right? That's also a question. Now, let's home in on this emotional empathy a moment. Definitely it's coming from the lower regions, midbrain, amygdala, then brainstem, hypothalamus, midbrain, hippocampus, and also the orbitofrontal cortex. And this actually helps us to feel very quickly without thinking. So we're sensing. There's an amazing neuroscientist in Leipzig, in Germany, Tanja Singer. And she actually says that you need to understand your own feelings to be able to understand the feelings of others. And this is where I always say that as educators, we have to work on ourselves, focus on ourselves, transform ourselves to then be able to help and tap into helping others. And this means we have to have 2 types of attention. We need to focus on our own experience of what you are feeling. So what is that connecting me back to? What am I remembering when I see you feeling that way? And then also me connecting in with what's happening to you. So it requires a lot of depth of understanding, attention, and feeling. That's emotional empathy. Now, let's just move on a minute, and then we're going to come back to empathy, because I want to tie empathy into compassion. And many of you who work with me, you know that I am very focused on compassion, which is the second step after empathy. So empathy is step one, compassion for me is step two. If we're talking about the holistic approach, if we're really talking about brain, heart, gut, the one thing that we have to always remember is that we are in fact physically interconnected. The mechanism, the makeup is connected. And in fact, what is connecting us is the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve from the back of the neck then connects into the brain, facial expressions, and down into all the major organs. It's a phenomenal nerve that runs all the way through the body. Vagus coming from the Latin, it means it's wandering, and it's wandering all over the body. And it really does coordinate breathing, heart rate, it's coordinating digestive processes, it's related to strong immune systems, it's also regulating the inflammatory responses, and it connects the oxytocin networks. You can measure the strength of your vagus nerve, by the way. And you can strengthen your vagus nerve with laughter, meditation, mindfulness. And it really does. When you strengthen the vagus nerve, it also demonstrates a stronger immune system. Very interesting how it affects the whole body. Now, when we go into compassion, what is actually happening is an area of the brain in that reptilian brain, which is called the periaqueductal brain, lights up. And that part of the brain triggers the vagus nerve. And when you go into compassion, you're really going into that question of, how can I help? What can I do? And again, Dr. Keltner, I mentioned him earlier, he's done a lot of research into compassion and what happens. And when we see suffering, when we see pictures or experience it firsthand, that reaction kicks in of how can we help? How can we stop? What can we do here? That's compassion. So empathy, if we look from the physiological side, empathy is about, I feel what you feel. I'm connecting with your feelings. And it's the reward and threat circuits that are lighting up. Plus, you've got the mirror neurons kicking in as well. And empathy is this, I feel what you feel. It's the ability to really sense that. Now, as a coach, as an educator, if I'm going into those emotions with you, and if we're staying in that point, how am I helping? So empathy is about that first step. I'm really sorry that you're feeling this way. I'm sensing this is really an extreme situation for you. But then the next step is moving into the compassion. And as I said, Tanya Singer has done a lot of research on this. And by the way, do have a look at her research, because she also talks about how to bring this into schools, into education. So she is the one that sort of says that compassion is a two-step process. It's that wanting to help. It's that wanting to understand what is it that's happening to you? How can we resolve it? What action can we take? It's that two-step. I feel what you feel. What can we do? And by the way, when we feel compassion, we're really releasing chemistry. Oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin. It is triggering the vagus nerve. They call it the sort of love circuit of the body. And as educators, I think this is where we need to be focused much more. You know, many, many times, and I've done this in the past as well, many times when we hear a learner saying that they don't feel good, they're having a bad time, we try to convince them. We try to change the way that they're feeling. Oh, don't be silly. I think you're doing great. I think you're doing fantastic. I've seen such great progress. Come on, you can do it. We're trying to convince. Now, actually, that means we're not being empathetic, but we're also not being compassionate. So instead of trying to convince and ignore what they're saying, we need to acknowledge, and more so nowadays that we have these kids in so much pain and trauma. So I'm really sorry that you're feeling this way. How can we help to make you feel better here? What needs to happen? How can we change the situation for you to help you to feel better? So building up the way we respond, building up the sensitivity with our responses is key. And, you know, the evidence is in the brain. What's happening when we feel empathy, when we feel compassion. It's about going beyond the empathy now. So I just now want to change the gear a minute, because we've talked a lot about the feelings, the emotions, but actually we're living in this era of neuro. We're coming into the meta. And again, I've gone to the dictionary to look for meta. Meta is an interesting word because it really is either an adjective, it can be a noun, it can be a prefix. It's a phenomenal word. But what I like about it is this number 3, transcending, going beyond. And I think whenever we hear the word meta, by the way, we've now got, I don't know what all of you think about this, but we've now got this metaverse coming in. How do you all feel about that? That we're going to be in this metaverse living, and oh man, it sounds like Star Trek and futuristic, but it's actually here, it's now. I'm curious in the chat box if any of you want to comment on that, if you've read the book. I'm curious what you all think about that. So meta is this question of beyond. And I do think it's about how can we go beyond and transcend in what we're doing, all of us, as educators, teachers, coaches, whatever. Because life is challenging and we need to go beyond the circumstances that we're living. Now, I had this sort of light bulb moment, because metacognition actually comes from 2 different words from 2 different origins. How curious is this? We've got meta coming from the Greek and cognition coming from the Roman, from the Latin. And in some ways, for me, that then sort of separated out the 2 areas of the brain. The cognition is the rational, the Latin ratio, really this cognitive prefrontal cortex. And the meta is that going beyond, that subconscious brain. And that's literally us, conscious, subconscious. And just to give you some other sort of definitions of metacognition, we've got Flavel saying cognition about cognitive phenomena, thinking about thinking. Yes. And also in 1988, the knowledge and control children have over their own thinking and learning activities. And then Hennessy in 99, awareness of one's own thinking, one's conception, active monitoring of the cognitive processes, and the ability to regulate. And I think this is, metacognition is about learning to manage ourselves, and also to bring that knowledge about how to manage the brain to others. So from the educator's perspective, what does it mean, this era of metacognition? Well, we say this many, many times. If we transform, we are going to be able to help the learners to transform. Everything starts with us. Everything starts with how we understand how to manage, how to sense, how to communicate in a different way. And being aware of our own impact, and forgive me, but I couldn't resist putting empathy and compassion in the same word. So I called it empacompassion. Maybe we've created a new word there today. Really, it is that two-step process. Empa with the step of second step compassion. Now, we have to understand how to detect triggers in learners. We have to be able to sense if there's something not quite right. In a minute, we're going to go deeper into that. But then we also have to understand how to communicate about this, how to bring it out. I always say, if you have a learner with an emotional trigger, I call it, it's like the pink elephant in the room. You have to address it, because if you don't, they're not going to be in a learning state. And we need to get them back into a learning state. That's what we're there for. Remember that if they go into a fight or flight, that brainstem message is going to get that full body response where hippocampus, prefrontal cortex are not fully functioning. And those are the key areas for learning. So until we get them into a calmer state, until we get that sort of learning state back, it's really going to be, well, useless, whatever we do. You know, years ago, and I'm sure all of you have had this in school, or I had this as an adult in Germany. I went to a lady for 2 German lessons, and I say 2 because I never went back after the second one. In the first one, she kind of was exploring a little bit, where is my German? I'm a very eclectic German speaker, by the way. I have German all over the place. And she was trying to tap into where I am, what level I am. That was the first session. And I thought, okay, fine. Second session, she opened the door. She looked at me and she said, oh, what can we do with you today? That triggered me so much that this person hadn't prepared, hadn't even thought about what to do with me, and literally did it when she saw me. That made me so triggered, angry. The whole of that session was a waste of time. And if I'd have known then what I know now, I would have said to her on the doorstep, okay, when you've thought about it, give me a call, I'm leaving. That's what I should have done. But actually I sat there and I was, there was smoke just coming out my ear the whole session, and I didn't learn anything. And I never went back. And that, for me, looking back, it proves that if you're not in the right learning state, you're not going to learn. So we need to address the triggers, we need to detect them, and then we need to bring it out and coach around them. And we need to understand how to coach around those triggers in such a way that we get them out of the threat into reward. And here is where using professional coaching, language, and communication will help. And then having that constant reflection afterwards. Just checking in to make sure that they never have that trigger again. Now, also as a coach, we have to understand that there are certain things that we can ask that are going to trigger their task positive network. And that's this red executive control network at the bottom here. If I'm asking analytical questions, logical questions, that's going to trigger the executive prefrontal cortex. Now, if I want them to go into feelings and I want them to go into creative, that's when I need to be asking questions, pushing them into vision, into emotions. That's going to get them with the default brain network. So there's different sort of responses that we can also be arousing, if you like, by how we communicate. And it's important to understand how to ask to trigger either or. So using these coaching conversations to troubleshoot triggers, learning issues, cognitive issues is very, very important for learners of today. And having that sensitivity to detect those triggers is going to be key. Now, I actually think that we're moving into a meta-language learning. Maybe I need to change neurolanguage coaching and make it into meta-language. Sounds cool, huh? But I do think, we're going beyond language learning. We're going into much more. We're going into depth, detecting, troubleshooting, helping to get them into that language learning path. How can we help? How can we come into this? Well, I do think it's about increased sensitivity. It's also increased respect for the individuals. No two brains are the same. So understanding that every person or group of people in front of you is different is key. And remember, everybody has their own interpretation of the world and the universe, and we have to adapt. And I know this sounds horrendously difficult if you've got a group of 30 in a class, but it's not impossible. And in that way, instead of having many, many children falling by the wayside, we're going to be trying to adapt to them and bringing in that inclusion and that neurodiversity that we are now living. That's the world we live in today. So let's just go into, I always think that neurolanguage coaching is a bit of a bridge. And as a bridge, what we're trying to do is to bring the neuroscience into practice. We're trying to implement what we know from the neuroscience. We're not just there to regurgitate the research, to tell our learners all about the research. No, we're there to live it, to feel it, to get them to feel it and experience it. So everything we do has a reason. Everything. And in that, we've got the intelligence, we've got the awareness, we've got the emotions. Now, intelligence means that we understand the brain. We understand learner autonomy, learner centricity, we understand the uniqueness, we understand that they potentially have a different way of learning. And may I share that I do think we need to be encouraging multiple intelligences. How many of you in your countries have Howard Gardner's multiple intelligence theory integrated into your educational system? Saskia, a little bit. Saskia, remind me where you're located in the chat box, if you can. I can't remember where you're located. So some countries integrate it, some countries absolutely do not. Britain doesn't. Argentina, Maca, yes, I know that you do. And I said this before, Argentina is one of the most amazing countries because they really integrate emotional intelligence and the multiple intelligences as well. Any other countries where you embrace Howard Gardner's theories? Ina, you learned about it, but do they integrate it? In France, they don't. Saskia, no. Yeah. In Holland, some schools, yes. Philippines, you do. Fantastic. Azerbaijan, you do. Amazing. Wow. Beautiful to hear that. Now, I actually think that we need to revisit this a bit more. And we need to get the educational systems to visit this a bit more. And it's not about imposing, it's about having choice for our learners to experience different ways of learning. And it's almost like what we're doing is opening up the learning as a voyage of discovery, rather than an imposition of this is how you do it. So, multiple intelligences and actually encouraging our learners to know the brain. How many of you have started to talk to your learners about the brain and they've got curious and they've wanted to know more? Curiosity is key. Curiosity is dopamine. Curiosity means motivation. Curiosity means we've got that fireball. Penelope, yes, absolutely. Absolutely, they love it. And you know what? When I first started all of this 10 years ago, you cannot imagine how heavily I've been criticized all along the way. Interestingly, one of the people that challenged me, he was from a university and he said, why on earth are you talking about the brain? I think it was 2015. And my answer was, isn't it time that we did? How can we continue to go through life without connecting ourselves to our major learning organ? And in education, how can we go through education without connecting into how we learn? And we're doing it. We are doing it. There's so much neuro now. It's beautiful. But the main problem is, are we living it? That's what we need to be doing. And that's what we are doing. So constantly being the provocateur, I think that is also the key. Now, forgive me, but I've created this equation. You've got IQ plus EQ plus language Q, and I'm connecting it into the NLCQ when you add them all together. Just a little quirky way of bringing it all together. Now, awareness. Awareness of ourselves. Awareness of the way that we communicate. Awareness of how to use silence as a tool. Awareness of how to sense what's happening to them all the time. And really that heightened perception. Just to share with you, last week I was in one of my training sessions. And I'm not giving any names, I'm not explaining who, where, why, and what. But in our training sessions, we do some life coaching. And in this particular training session, in this particular example, there was a model. I was the coach and I was modeling coaching. And there was a moment where I actually acknowledged, recognized, praised the coaching. And believe me, there was something that I sensed. It was almost like a slight flinch when I did that. And something crossed my mind to say, don't ever do that again. Don't praise her again. And we continued with the process, with the coaching, and we went right through, and I didn't do it again. Now, for those of you who know me, in coaching, we're constantly trying to find moments where we can bring the mirror and say, hey, well done. Hey, may I just recognize you for this? When we came to the feedback part, interestingly, the person shared with me, I hate it when they praise me. I can't stand it. And when you did that, it was like, oh. And I shared with her, I sensed that. And that's the reason I didn't do it anymore. And at that point, she realized, yeah, I hadn't. But I can't tell you, I can't tell any of you what it was that I sensed, but I sensed it. Maybe there was just a flicker. Maybe there was just a movement that was unusual. but something somewhere sensed it. Now, when you come into coaching and when you really come into that professional, constant practice as a coach, you start to pick up more and more subconscious signals. It takes practice and practice and practice and practice. And what actually is key is the depth of our listening, and also how we ask those questions and how we mirror back and how we have the balance in that process. There are no power struggles, actually coachee absolutely equal, and bringing out the focus and attention. And from the emotional side, I also think the more calm and serene we are, the more you're going to get them to calm down. You know, we've got those mirror neurons going. And I always think, I love this word in Spanish, especially, soberano. Soberana. It's almost that feeling of being equanimous, sitting in those moments and being able to deal with anything in a very calm fashion. That's what the coachee is picking up as well. And knowing the impact of social pain, knowing how it affects each and every one of us, knowing how we can be triggered into a fight or flight, knowing that many of our learners today are traumatized. Some of you may have heard this before, and I think we do have some people from Bolivia in the audience. I was pre-pandemic in Santa Cruz, and we did actually do some free talks with Dora. Buenas tardes. Yes, we did actually do some talks in an area of Santa Cruz that was very poverty-stricken, deprived, lots of trouble, drugs, etc. And the teachers were struggling. The teachers were really struggling with the situation. The children were not responsive, the parents were not responsive, and the teachers were desperate. And as we came into this sort of discussion, it was how to change that sort of expectation that we have as educators and teachers into how can we change this? Compassion. And the one thing that these teachers have not realized is that not only were they dealing with traumatized children, they were also dealing with traumatized parents. Many of the parents were one-parent families, poverty-stricken, difficulties at home with work. So of course the parents couldn't respond. How can people respond where they are up to the limit with stress? And how can they then respond for children? And how can we as educators expect that situation where the parents should blah, blah, blah? They can hardly deal with themselves. So as soon as the teachers changed that perspective and really started to think, okay, compassion, and getting the kids in the saying, right, okay, I'm really sorry this is happening. I'm sensing there's so much happening for you at home. What can I do to help you? What can we do to transform you, your life, your future? And giving those kids that sort of anchor of somebody there who's there to help them is key. Now, how do we develop sensitivity? This is a very interesting question. And I think many of you probably, just from life experience, you already have a lot of sensitivity. And especially those of you like me, when we get to a certain age in life, and we've got an accumulation of experiences and things that have happened, obviously your sensitivity is heightened. But it's how do we get it even deeper? Yesterday I was working with an advanced group of mine, and we were really starting to work on these deeper levels of coaching competencies. And we're going to look at those in a minute. And paralinguistics. And how do we get into that greater observation? Remember me at the airport. Observing without seeing. How do we do that? And, you know, one of the key points is, how do we trust our subconscious brain? And how do we not ignore what we're sensing and feeling? And finding out from the learner. Asking the right questions is key. When I was a baby coach 15 years ago, I trained with David Rock's method. If any of you are into coaching and you're interested to become a life coach, I strongly recommend you have a look at brain-based coaching by the Neuroleadership Institute. David Rock is the pioneer in brain-based coaching in the world. And well, I did a coaching course which was actually called intuitive coaching. And the two leading coaches for that training were Richard Bentley, who actually is and has been since that year. He became my mentor, my coach mentor, and Rachel Bamba. And if any of you have ever been to my NeuroHeart Education Conference, you know that they are two of my favorite speakers at the conference, both Rachel and Richard, phenomenal coaches. And I remember witnessing a coaching session with Rachel as the coach. And it was mind-blowing. It was mind-blowing. You know, she sat there with her coachee and she said to the coachee, there was one moment where she said to the coachee, you know, I'm seeing this enormous fan that's just opened out. And the coachee said to her, that's exactly what I was just thinking. Whoa, we were blown away in that room that she had captured exactly the image of what her coachee was thinking. And this is what I mean about this type of sensitivity. Now, on this intuitive coaching with Rachel and Richard, I have to share that, you know, for many, many years, I had always been very frustrated because I had never felt that I was intuitive, because I don't see things and I don't hear things. And, you know, you see, like Rachel said, I see this enormous fan. And you have other people saying, I hear that this is what you're saying. I could never, and for many, many years, this was always my sticking point. In that particular training, for the first time in my life, they connected me with the fact I feel things. I don't see and hear, I feel them. And it was the first time for me that I recognized, okay, I'm different because I feel. And then my question is, okay, if I feel something, how do I then stick with it and listen to it? And I would say that was the first time in my life that I started to pay attention to what I was feeling. So I'm hoping that might help some of you, because we're all different. And you may also be somebody who is a sentient and nothing else. So finding out what works for you, finding out how those messages come to you is key. It really is. And as a coach, you know, we always say active listening, deep listening, but when you get into being an advanced coach, you are listening for all of these levels. And as a language coach, believe me, you've got 7 levels here of listening. You're listening for facts, you're listening for emotions, you're listening for opinions and judgments, you're listening for negative, positive, you're listening for paralinguistics, but then you're listening for grammar, structure, language, and vocabulary, sense, lexis. Wow. How do you listen for all of that? Now, we do a lot of exercises working on this, and believe me, when we start to do the exercises for this, it's almost like you start opening up those channels. And that's when you go into that deeper listening. Plus, you have to go into deeper questioning. And you have to go into conscious questioning. It's not enough anymore just to fire out those questions without thinking. We have to be conscious of our questions. And here I would say we have to go back to Socratic methods of inquiry. I say to many who do the course, you know, Socrates used to bite his lip to stop talking. We have to ask a question, bite our lip, get them talking. And we have to ask the right question at the right time. And that means one question at a time. When I hear people asking one and then reformulating and then another and then another, I'm going in my chair one step down every time I hear multiple questions. And honestly, it's more often than not, it's habit, because we didn't like the question. They heard it the first time. So again, this is about modifying the way that we are trying to get them to think. And here, this is fascinating, you know, this paralinguistics. Paralinguistics are key. And Moravian actually says that we communicate only 7% through words. Only 7% through words. Ah, that's pretty scary, huh? So non-verbal is essential. As soon as you see somebody move or flinch or something happen, that should be something that we're paying attention to. And body language can be facial, posture, eye contact. You know, in NLP, and by the way, everybody, I've never done NLP, but I know from Jodie, who took me through this last month, where you're looking with your eyes is also indicative. And that can also give us a clue of what's happening mentally. And even proxemics. Are you one of those people that if somebody stands next to you, you jump a mile? How people are positioning themselves next to each other is interesting as well. And if we think about nonverbal and we go a little bit deeper into this, and you as language experts, what about intonation, pauses, enunciation? What about emphasis? All of that may be telling us something about what's happening with them. And again, it's about training the ear to listen for the unusual. And here we get a little bit deep, everybody, into this subconscious brain. I do think it's the area of the brain that fascinates all of us, and it's the area of the brain that we don't know anything about. Even the neuroscientists, they're still discovering. A couple of things to share with you about the subconscious brain. And the first one is this beautiful expression of chicken sexing. Interesting story, and I took it from one of those books that talks about the brain, one of those mainstream books. Very fascinating, because I believe it was the turn of the century, 19th to 20th century. And the Japanese apparently were the best in the world at distinguishing the sex of baby chicks. And apparently, as soon as a baby chick was born, these Japanese experts could tell male or female. Now, the problem is that when you look at a chick, I've never done this before. I don't know if any of you have. Heather might have. Heather, you might have got some chicks at home. I know. Honestly, they look the same. They don't look any different. And the British were fascinated. How do the Japanese do this? And they sent a team of British over to Japan, and they said to the experts, tell us, how do you do it? And the Japanese said, we don't know. We just know. We instinctively know the difference. And the British said, well, teach us. And they said, well, we can't. We don't know how we do it. And what they then did, literally, they got the British holding up the chick and saying male or female, and the Japanese expert would say right or wrong. And they did this for a time. And slowly, 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 the British became experts in distinguishing the difference. That difference wasn't there for the naked eye. That difference was there for the subconscious brain. And they became experts in it. Now, apparently there's a similar story with the warplanes in England. In the war, there were certain groups of people that could absolutely distinguish when it was the enemy plane or British planes. They didn't know how they did it. Now, what I'm trying to bring across here is our subconscious brain more often than not knows. How do we trust that? That's the challenge for each and every one of us. Because more often than not, this prefrontal cortex will be questioning, doubting. And more often than not, your subconscious brain will be right first off. So developing this intuition, I think, is actually the key to move forward. But each and every one of us has to do that by ourselves. We have to understand how to create that sort of feeling of, yes, I'm right, and I'm going to stick with it. So it's about the subconscious brain picking up those signals and you acting on them. And with your learners, checking in with them, finding out, am I sensing this? Can I share with you what I'm sensing? And really seeing if it's that or if it's something else. And, you know, we also are very focused on how do we come into explicit learning, implicit learning. Explicit learning, where you're really focused on information, data, engaging rational, logical, analytical, but implicit, where you're just absorbing. So we also have to bring in to our learners that understanding that if they went on an immersion setting to learn a language, they would be bombarding their subconscious brain with language. How can they do that where they live? What can they do to replicate immersion settings at home? And maybe they could challenge themselves for a couple of months, 3 months. Try it, see what happens. And you'll be amazed at just what they will be amazed at what they are picking up. I had one German learner in north of Germany quite a few years ago. He would only read English books. He read English novels. Honestly, his vocabulary was incredible. He would come out with words, and I would say to him, Thomas, where on earth did you get that word? And he knew exactly. I got it from this book. Whoa! His subconscious brain was picking it up. I've got another lady who actually wanted to learn Greek. And what she did for 6 months, she listened to Greek songs. And she called me after 6 months and said, Rachel, you wouldn't believe how much I've learned just from listening to the music and the songs and being curious about what they're saying. So these are the conversations that we also need to be having about the subconscious brain with our learners to get them stimulated more and more to learn. Not only with us, not only explicitly, but also implicitly. Now we're on a journey, and the journey is this question of how to bring in this new trend of neuro-heart education. And just to share with all of you, we are about to launch a logo, very exciting, and we'll be launching that over the next weeks, I hope. And it is this question of how do we start to adapt to the 21st century, bringing in the neuroscience, bringing in the coaching, bringing in all of this, what we would say the holistic approach, the emotional intelligence, the multiple intelligence, everything into teaching, training, and developing people. Whether it's a language, whether it's all teachers, whether it's even parents, hopefully we'll be coming into those programs as well. And finally, just want to walk into this sort of dedication to the Neurolanguage Coaches across the world. We do have the accreditation from the ICF. By the way, I'm very, very delighted this year. I will be speaking at the ICF conference in October. So very excited about that. And I have to share as well that this network of Neurolanguage Coaches are phenomenal. They really are building up this sensitivity with the learners and coming into that sort of interaction and deeper understanding. So well done to all of you who are out there. Now, I do think it's about knowing ourselves. And we said this various times today. And it's about moving away from being caught up in the feeling to being aware that you're in the feeling. And then we've got all of these metas: meta mood, meta emotion, metacognition, even understanding how to label emotions to neutralize them, understanding that meditation is key to be able to manage the brain and brain states, understanding that we do have tools like neurofeedback to understand brain waves. We've got rapid eye movement as well to help people with trauma, life coaching, yoga, hypnosis, also understanding that resilience can be built. So there's so many things that we can be doing, and also sharing with our learners for them to do. And just to share with all of you, I would say in the last it's probably about 8 years now. In the last 8 years that I've become a very, very, very serious meditator, I would say in these 8 years, my intuition and my understanding of my brain states has really increased. Now, I'm not saying that you should all go away and meditate, but I'm saying that it is about finding each and every one of us, our way to, may I say, dominate the brain. The Tibetans say that the brain is like a wild horse. You either sit on the horse and take the reins and you're the one who is steering and riding the horse, or it's running in front of you, galloping away. And I think most of our life, my brain was galloping in front of me. I think now I've finally got hold of it, and I'm working with it. So we're going to open the chat, the live in a minute. There are some courses coming up, everybody. If any of you want to come over to Stitches, very exciting. We're doing a face-to-face. You know, we were 2 years without doing face-to-face courses, and now we're starting to do them across the world. And I will be in Stitches at the end of July. There is a morning course. There is an intensive weekend course for the Americas. And that then in Europe is, I think it's 9:30 in the evening. Yeah, it is. And there's an evening course in August as well. And I know that I said this last week. We have changed our pricing system back to how it was pre-pandemic. But it is very, very easy to get discounts. And it's very easy to get 50% discount on the course. So if any of you want to take a quick photo, we do send this information out. But as I say, there are sort of ways to get the discounts, and especially to get the 50% or the even 65% discount. So it's not an impossibility to actually be able to get to the price that the course has been over the last few months. a few years actually. It's been 2 years that we slashed the prices because of the pandemic.